The Moondrop Blessing 3 is a highly anticipated IEM and has some big shoes to fill. Succeeding the well-regarded Blessing 2 and Blessing 2 Dusk, does the Blessing 3 offer a worthwhile upgrade? Well, let's find out. I'm GoldenSound, and you're watching The Headphone Show by Headphones.com. Opening up the box, the IEMs themselves are presented nicely alongside a sleek hardshell faux leather case that will do a nice job of protecting the IEMs when taking them out and about. And also, it's big enough that you don't have to fuss with the IEMs for 5 minutes to fit them in. That was something that after a longer period using them did start to annoy me with the Kato and their smaller case, whereas here you can just coil them up and toss them in. The included cable is fairly nice too. It's soft, flexible and non-microphonic, a little bit of rubbery shape memory in the top half though. There's a selection of silicone tips included, and actually on that note, one of the changes from the previous Blessing 2 is that the nozzle of the IEM is now thinner. As a result, these do now fit me quite a bit more comfortably, and I imagine there's a lot of people who are going to be thankful for that as well. Otherwise, the shell itself is mostly unchanged from the Blessing 2, besides the new glossy faceplate, which I do quite like the looks of, though it does pick up fingerprints a lot easier than the brush metal finish on the previous version. The rest of the updates are internal. The Blessing 3 is using 6 drivers in total, 4 balanced armatures, same as the Blessing 2, but instead of 1 dynamic driver, it is now using 2 dynamic drivers, which Moondrop says is to improve bass dynamics. And they're set up in what they are calling the horizontally opposed dual dynamic drivers unit system, or HODDUS. The acronym really could have used some improvement. I mean, if the aim is to improve bass dynamics, then you could have called it the symmetrical layout acoustic module or something, for example. But anyway, there's also been improvements to the 3D printed internal structure, which forms part of the crossover system. It's done using both a crossover circuit and the physical acoustic design as well. And all of these changes, according to Moondrop, result in improved bass dynamics, better perceived dynamic range, lower distortion, and, well, let's see if that holds up and talk about subjective sound. This is my personal subjective view on the Blessing 3. I mostly ran them off the Chord Mojo 2 and experimented with a few different tip options, but I'm mostly basing my opinions here with the stock tips. As always, your experience may differ. The first thing that stood out to me when trying the Blessing 3 wasn't the tuning, it was the overall technical capability. This certainly seems to be a noticeable step up from both previous Blessing line products and other Moondrop products such as the Kato in terms of sheer resolution. The detail retrieval and also the spatial cues, possibly helped by a slightly lifted upper treble region, are a clear step up and are rivaling products far more expensive. Clearly, Moondrop's previous experience and what they're doing with the iterative 3D printed design approach is working well here. The main thing that people seem to be talking and asking about though is whether the new dynamic driver design is going to bring a punchier, more dynamic presentation to the bass than the previous Blessing 2 or Blessing 2 Dusk, and it does with some trade-offs. Playing a track such as Tearing Me Up by Bob Moses, and the bass synth is absolutely harder hitting and tighter, more controlled sounding on the Blessing 3 than it was on the Blessing 2. It's absolutely an improvement. But this effect seems somewhat track dependent, because if you go to something like Goat by Polyphia, then the kick drum in this was sounding a little bit more pillowy than I'm used to it sounding, and around 25 seconds I think there's a synth which comes in which was there, but it wasn't forceful. It wasn't giving me that rumble that I usually want it to have. And I think that this is because whilst the bass dynamics have been improved on the Blessing 3, the tuning, particularly in the mid-bass region, has changed a lot. It's a lot further down. And so as a result of this, the improved bass dynamics are mostly noticeable with more sub-bass focused content. With more mid-bass focused content, you can't notice it as much because it's kind of pushed back to begin with. Moving into the mid-range, this still impacts things here a bit too, particularly with deeper male vocals. La Voce del Silenzio by Andrea Bocelli sounds both impressive and lacking on the Blessing 3. The actual detail, the separation between elements, is a clear step up over the Blessing 2, and from a technical standpoint, the Blessing 3 is performing wonderfully here. It's really good, and it is an improvement in that area. But that lack of lower mid-range means that Andrea's voice sounds brighter and slightly shoutier, to be honest, than usual, and just leaves it sounding overall thin. A big portion of what makes up the richer timbre of his voice is just not present enough. Female vocals, or higher male vocals, escape that suck-out in the lower mids and mid-bass though, and can show off the improved technical performance without much limitation. My Baby Just Cares for Me on the Capitol Studios sessions is a good track for showing off what the Blessing 3 can do when the track suits it. Haley Reinhardt's vocals sounded really just about right here, including being able to reflect the smoothness earlier on in the track, and then being able to get just aggressive enough during the final parts around 3 minutes and 50 seconds or so. This track's also good for testing the lower level quieter aspects, the spatial cues in particular, and there's not a huge number of IEMs that I find do a great job of showing the room that something was recorded in, but these really do, and whether that's as a result of the improved distortion that Moondrop was talking about, or potentially and probably most likely the area upper treble response, I'm not sure, but whatever it is, it's working. From a subjective standpoint, and we'll discuss objective next, I'm left a little torn. This is an improvement in technical ability from its predecessor. It is more detailed, it is more spacious, it separates things better, but it seems that there are two main tuning issues which hold it back. The first being that whilst not necessarily an outright shouty IEM, it can definitely lean that way at times to my ear. Secondly, the mid-bass to lower mid-range region is a little absent, and this can in many instances make the Blessing 3 sound somewhat thin in presentation, particularly with male vocals. Both of these issues are quite easily addressed with EQ though, and doing that does absolutely leave you with what, in my opinion, is a better and more technically capable IEM than either Moondrop's Blessing 2 or their Kato. So for me, it comes down to whether or not you're willing to use EQ. If you are, these can be tweaked to be great quite easily, and if you're not, then the type of music you're going to listen to is going to be the big determining factor in whether these are going to work well, or if they're going to sound a bit too thin. This is the frequency response of the Blessing 3, taken on a Grass 43AG, and the dashed red line shows the IEF neutral target. Starting down in the bass, we can see quite a prominent lift, particularly in the sub-bass, but one that rolls off quite quickly towards 100 Hz and reaches a minimum as we move into the lower mid-range at around 250 Hz. The steepness of this rise is likely why the perceived bass presence and dynamics are quite track-dependent. More sub-bass focused content is a lot more prominent than more mid-bass focused content. And the mid-range generally is comfortably lower than the IEF neutral target, so without EQ this can make things sound a little thin. The bottom of the V shape is also down close to 250 Hz, as opposed to being around 700 Hz or so on other IEMs from Moondrop, such as the Blessing 2 and the Kato. With the frequency response aligned to the target at 1 kHz, we can see an upper mid-range that follows the neutral target quite closely, but continues on to a peak at around 3 kHz, which is a few dB above. This is likely why they can be perceived as shouty at times, though again, easy to EQ down if you do find it to be an issue. The treble then follows the target quite closely with a fairly narrow dip below, leading to a slightly lifted upper treble above 16 kHz, which can help contribute to that area, more open presentation. If we compare the Blessing 3 to the Blessing 2, our treble profile is quite similar. The Blessing 3 has more upper treble extension, which likely accounts again for the more open sounding result, and possibly contributes to the improved bass dynamics. Our perception of impact isn't just in the bass, it's in part in that leading edge transient, the high frequency part of it, and so even if the bass areas are completely unchanged, if you attenuate the upper treble, then things can sound subjectively softer. From about 6 kHz down to 700 Hz, things are extremely similar. And from there, as we move down into the lower mid-range and the bass region, the Blessing 3 shows at times close to 6 dB lower than the Blessing 2. They end up fairly similar by the time you get deep into the sub-bass, but the most obvious difference between the two is the significant reduction in lower mids on the Blessing 3. Comparing now to the Moondrop Kato, we see a very similar difference in the mid-bass and lower mid-range. The Kato is slightly higher between 1 kHz and 2500 Hz, which can make vocals sound slightly more forward, though that doesn't have quite the same 3 kHz peak. The upper treble is similar in terms of overall level, but your own ears are going to dictate which of the two has a preferable profile here. The main difference that might be slightly more universal is that the Kato doesn't have the same extension past 15 kHz, and to my ear the Kato definitely sounds less airy than the Blessing 3, so that could be why. The Moondrop Blessing 3 offers a definitive step up in technical ability from its predecessors, and in the areas of detail, separation, and even staging, it is outperforming even quite a lot more expensive IEMs. Where it doesn't so much fall behind, but definitely could be somewhat polarizing, is in the overall lean presentation. It's one that without EQ might leave many people wanting more in terms of engagement and a fuller sound, such as that offered by the original Blessing 2 or the Kato. I hope you found that video interesting and useful, and if you're interested in purchasing a pair of Blessing 3, they are available at headphones.com. And if you want to come and ask me or other Wiggly Air enthusiasts any questions about music, gear, or anything else at all, then come and say hi on our Discord server or the headphones.com forum. Thank you very much for watching. Until next time.